I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Garrett Evans. We all know. Garrett is a program officer and facilitator with Gender Equity and Reconciliation International, and he received his Bachelor of Science in Conflict Resolution from Portland State University. Garrett maintains a daily practice of meditation and silent prayer and has discovered a deepening love for the world's great contemplative traditions. And he feels called to bring together his contemplative practice with healing work in the world. So please join me in warmly welcoming Garrett Evans.
Thank you, and good morning. So this last week we had our New Year's retreat down in Washington, and there were about 27 of us together for 4 or 5 days, just sharing that time in silence and prayer and meditation and reflection, and it was just a beautiful time of being together in a kind of shared aspiration and shared prayerfulness. And as I was sitting in meditation on one of the days, kind of just reflecting on this sharing, what kept coming to me was something about the power of truth, and about the power of truth to liberate and to heal and transform and to revivify, to kind of create a space where new life can start to flow in. You know, as Jesus proclaims in the Gospel of John, the truth will set you free. And of course that's true in our spiritual lives as we kind of bear witness to the truth of our own being, and as our own truth is revealed on deeper levels. And it's also true in very human ways. And in the integrity and truthfulness within ourselves and in our relationships. So there's a very kind of real and practical application of this. And that as we start to bring truth to those areas in our lives or in ourselves where there may have been illusion or less than truth, it kind of naturally initiates a healing process. I was very struck when I was reading Myrtle Fillmore about her own process of finding healing, physical healing. And she says, "I went to all the life centers in my body and spoke words of truth to them, words of strength and power." So there's something about seeing deeply, recognizing the deep nature of something and affirming the truth that is healing. In the same way that when somebody sees us, when somebody really sees us deeply, it creates a kind of freedom and liberation. And the same when we see somebody else, that's a gift, kind of allowing somebody to be and manifest who they really are, that there's a gift and a freedom in that. As you may know, a lot of the work I do with Will and Cynthia is around this gender equity and reconciliation, which is bringing together men and women to jointly confront gender injustice and gender dysfunction, and together to confront that and find a way through to kind of reclaiming right relations between men and women. And so we're really working with the power of truth in this. We often bring forward this quote from Martin Luther King Jr., where he says, "Injustice and corruption will never be transformed by keeping them hidden, but only by bringing them out into the light and confronting them with the power of love." And that's really the kind of purpose and methodology of that work. And so I just want to share very briefly kind of how I was drawn into this. I've shared before that after going to high school, I went to live in a Zen Buddhist monastery for a couple of years. And it's a very formative time that deepened and transformed my whole orientation towards prayer and meditation. And after a couple of years there, it was kind of, something had shifted, and it was kind of time for me to transition into a different phase. And shortly after leaving, I was talking with a friend of mine on the phone, and I said something very strange. That I was feeling that part of my work in the world had to do with healing and reconciliation between men and women. And she said to me, well, I just met these people who do this thing called gender reconciliation. You should check it out. So I looked it up online, and I found the book Divine Duality that Will and Cynthia wrote, and I started reading it. And a lot of what the book is, it's kind of stories of these workshops and what's happened in these workshops. And reading the stories, it was like I was being transported into the workshop. And what was happening there was a level of truth-telling between men and women that was almost beyond what I thought was possible. And more than that, I could feel that out of just telling each other the truth, that something new was being revealed, something new was being born. There was a new way of being together as men and women that was made possible just through telling the truth. And so I wrote to Will and Cynthia and just shared how inspired and moved I had been by that. And that's how I started, that's how I got into this whole work, how I met them. And so we really work with the power of truth in that process. We spend the first day or so creating an environment where it's safe to bring out some of these truths around gender and sexuality, things that usually don't have a space to be spoken. And as we do that, kind of very delicately, there can be a kind of intensity to that whole process of revealing what has been hidden, but kind of mysteriously and magically and beautifully, what starts to happen as we continue to reveal ourselves more fully is that something starts to be liberated, something starts to be freed up. We start to see each other in a new way. We start to see each other more deeply. And this creates a kind of joyful freedom. And one of the last processes we do in the workshop is an honoring ceremony, where the men create a ceremony to honor and uplift the women, and the women do the same for the men. And it's kind of a making real and recommitting ourselves to a kind of renewed covenant and possibility of what relations can be. And I just want to share from a recent workshop. We've recently done one in New York with some United Nations affiliates, and before that in Boston with clergy and religious leaders. And I just want to share one of the men's reflections from this ceremony. It was very beautiful. So first, the men had created and offered this ceremony for the women, and the women then did the same for the men. And as they were leading us into the room, on the door was a sign that said, "Welcome back to Eden." Kind of a re-entering of a kind of original innocence. And this is his reflection. We walked towards the meeting room where there was a sign on the door that said, "Welcome to Eden." After having spent a few days really baring my soul and uncovering my own brokenness and better understanding more the pain others have experienced, seeing that sign made my heart leap with hope at what relations between men and women were intended to be and can be in the context of communion with their Creator. And so this is kind of what he was feeling and expressing, is a kind of expression of the new possibility and inspiration that's made possible through bearing with truth. And it also, there's a saying that truth must not only be understood, but withstood. And so he's somewhat also speaking to the initial challenge of being confronted with these truths, but that he had the kind of earnest commitment to bear with it. And through that, this new, profound, and I think surprising possibility started to open. So I'll share another personal story about this in a moment. But first, I want to share a kind of teaching on this that's been very formative for me. If I go back to shortly after I left the monastery, one of the teachers that's really spoke to me, that I was reading a lot of at that time, is Adyashanti, if you're familiar with him. He's a teacher in the Zen tradition. And he has this book called The End of Your World. And one of the chapters is called Coming Completely Out of Hiding. And I remember when I was listening to this on audiobook, and when I first heard this chapter, it so struck me, this idea, coming completely out of hiding. And it spoke to me in such a way, I listened to that chapter nearly every day for something like a year. It so spoke to my experience. And in this chapter, he talks about truthfulness as a kind of natural outgrowth and manifestation of awakening. And he talks about what it means to tell the truth, and not asserting truth or telling somebody else how it is or what my judgments or projections are. He says, no, truth is much more intimate than that. He says it has the quality of a kind of confession, not of something we've done that's bad or wrong, but just of the quality of coming completely out of hiding and speaking from a place of real unprotectedness. And he says in order to do this, we have to have the willingness to meet those places inside ourselves that are afraid to do that, or that want to kind of maintain the illusion of control that comes from telling less than the truth. And he talks about this willingness, this kind of sincere willingness to bring that which is unconscious and bring it into consciousness, liberate it. And that sincerity is the key to this. And he says that you need to discover a level of sincerity that does not try to hide from anything. And he says something very beautiful. He says, this kind of sincerity arises from that which loves the truth and sees that the truth is the greatest good. And that this is a kind of natural manifestation of the real nature of being. He says it very beautifully. He says that awakening itself, of its own accord, moves towards and into that which is not awake. That line always so stays with me. And so I just want to share a kind of personal story from a workshop, a gender reconciliation workshop a few years back. It was a pretty unique program, and usually we do them in 3 days with 20 to 30 people. And this was a program that was 5 days with close to 80 of us. And we were also incorporating it with, if you're familiar with holotropic breath work, we were incorporating those two modalities together, so breathing in one part of the day and then doing the gender work in the other. And all of this kind of intensified the cauldron. So there's always a certain kind of intensity to the work, but this really amped it up. And on the evening of the third day, one of the women stood and started to share how her experience of this workshop, that even in this gender reconciliation workshop, she had been experiencing kind of unwanted sexual advances from some of the men. And she started to very powerfully and incisively articulate some of the kind of gender shadows and hidden agendas around sexuality that were right there, including kind of calling out a couple of unnamed men who it essentially propositioned her. And so as this began to unfold, I felt this like intense charge and intensity come into the room and into myself. And I, like I imagine many of the men, started to very carefully comb through and and replay my every interaction, word, and glance I had shared with this woman. You know, is there any way she's talking about me? And so as she finished sharing, there was this charge in the room, and so we called for a short break in silence where the facilitation team met with her and a couple of the kind of implicated men, and we convened into a kind of facilitated process we sometimes use when dealing with these intense conflict situations in the full group. And so we had a smaller circle in the center with our facilitators and her and the two men and some of their kind of support people. And in the outer circle, the rest of us, about 70 of us, were sitting in a kind of silent witness and silent, really holding a prayer for the process in the inner circle. And so we convened into this configuration and had a kind of short prayer and invocation. And then began a dialogue process with those in the center where she directly confronted these two men. And, sitting in the outer circle with the rest, I was kind of continuing to grapple with the intensity of my own experience and kind of continuing that, careful review of my every word and thought and, right down to my eye movements and the length of my gaze and really questioning, like, have I really been impeccable in every way? And I had the feeling that, while she was kind of calling out and naming a couple of particular men and a couple of these particular incidents, she was also naming something that applied more broadly, that also applied to me. And that while that wasn't me in the center of the circle, that there was something about this whole process of her sharing and this process that was happening that was shining the light into kind of the dark recesses of my own inner being. And so I had this question, have I really been impeccable? And if I haven't, what would I be doing in the center of that circle? How would I be showing up there? And so as this process continued, these two men, much to their credit, both acknowledged the truth of what she was bringing forward and kind of shared that it was kind of a part of their own unconscious, unintegrated patterns around sexuality. Even so, that kind of charge in the room was still there, and the charge in me was still there. Like that level of admission had not satisfied her or the room. And so seemingly the truth had been confessed, and yet we were not set free. And so sitting in the outer circle myself, I was feeling this kind of empathic resonance with what was happening in the center, and continuing to ask, how would I be showing up, and what's really being called for? What's being asked of me? And as I sat there kind of continuing to struggle with the disturbing intensity of my own experience and questioning, it suddenly kind of dawned on me the level of accountability that was being asked for. And it started to kind of open something within me. In a way beyond the kind of fact of the sexual advance itself that was being named and the acknowledgement of this, there was a kind of deeper level that still wasn't being spoken to. In a way, there can still be a kind of hiding out in, yes, I did this, but it wasn't my intention, or I didn't really mean to, or it was an unconscious pattern. And it occurred to me that the level that was actually being called for was something like, yes, I did that, and in that moment I chose to do that. It actually was my intention. And on one level, it's true that these patterns are unconscious and that we kind of do things that are against our highest self and highest aspiration. On another level, there's a choice and a decision that's being made. And to kind of acknowledge that moment of choice, that's actually the process of bringing what's unconscious into consciousness. To say, yes, I did this, and in that moment I meant to, it's another level of responsibility. And it's actually bringing the light of consciousness into that area of kind of murky, mixed intention, and shining that light there and dispelling that. And so this all kind of came to me in a moment, that this was the level of truth that was being demanded. And that if I was really going to be fully honest with myself, that was the level of truth I needed to hold myself to. And as soon as this came into me, all of that inner division and inner conflict and inner struggle that I was feeling just released itself. And I knew that in this tension and conflict that we were going to find our way through. That like something had released in me, and I knew that we as a group would find our way through. And so as the dialogue continued in the center, they came to a closure and a kind of mutual resolution that included an apology and the acceptance of that. And then the next day when they had the opportunity, I thanked her for her sharing, and kind of very, very delicately shared some of what my own experience and process and insight had been with her. And we just shared a kind of beautiful moment of mutual appreciation and kind of recognition of one another, that we had seen each other in some way. And so, I have some different reflections on this experience, part of it being, that there was initially a kind of level of truth in myself that I was willing to go to, but it wasn't enough to actually liberate, and that I needed to kind of bear with it to find a deeper truth within myself that would liberate that division I was feeling. And also the kind of reciprocal nature of truth, in her sharing of truth revealed a deeper truth in me, and then that my sharing of that with her was a kind of mutual liberation that kind of freed something in both of us. There's a saying attributed to Jesus, if you're familiar with the Gospel of Thomas, where he says, "Let one who seeks not stop seeking until that person finds. And upon finding, the person will be disturbed. And after being disturbed, will be astonished. Then they will reign over everything." And so this kind of succinctly captures something about the process of discovering truth. That there can be challenge or disturbance as what has been unconscious is brought into consciousness, that there's a challenge and there's something kind of that can be disconcerting about that. And yet if we bear with it, and as we kind of willingly open to truth on a different level, that something in us starts to open, our hearts and minds starts to open, something new starts to be revealed that's kind of astonishing. And that as this opening continues, he says you will reign over everything. So we start to kind of discover a level of sovereignty. Right? We start to be freed from the unconscious patterns that used to be driving us. As those are liberated, there's a kind of sovereignty that emerges. And we're kind of freed from the way we were bound from the past, and it opens a kind of new generative possibility for the future. And as Adya says, there's a kind of simple sincerity of spirit that's so key to this. Like the love of truth for its own sake. So as we stand here on the first Sunday of our new year and our new decade, kind of on the threshold of what has and what will be, may our prayer be that we are grounded in this sincerity and love of truth, knowing that awakening itself moves towards and into that which is not awake. And may this sincerity be our compass as we walk in our lives, inwardly and outwardly. Thank you.